Welcome to this rapid revision video of my predictions for the Pearson Edexcel Paper 2 GCSE History exam for 2025. The topics I'll be covering are Early Elizabethan England, Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, the American West, and the Cold War and superpower relations. If you're doing one of the other topics which I've not mentioned here, sadly I don't know these specifications and papers well enough in order to make any sort of informed judgment or predictions on them. So I'm really sorry about that, but hopefully one of the other videos will help you. Anyway, let's have a look at the changes to the exam for this year. There have been some minor revisions to the way that the papers are working in this year. In 2024 and earlier, the exam looked something like this. The change in paper 2 comes with the first question, explain 2 consequences for 8 marks. Here's how it looks now. Question 1 has become question 1A and question 1B. Each will be worth 4 marks. You'll need to explain 1 consequence related to 2 different areas of knowledge. For example, explain 1 consequence of the discovery of gold in California on law and order. And then you might have to do a follow-up of explain 1 consequence of the Homestead Act for migration. This is probably a positive change overall. It allows you to be tested on a broader range of knowledge, and it means that if you're really unlucky and you don't understand one of the questions, you've got a good chance with the second one. There have been some minor revisions to the British depth study part of the paper too. Questions in 2024 and before looked like this, and the changes come to the first question again. Here's what it looks like now. Question 1 has been split in 2 again, question 1A and question 1B. Each will be worth 2 marks. You will need to give 1 example about 2 different areas of knowledge. So it might look like this. Describe 1 feature of Elizabethan government for 2 marks and describe 1 feature of Drake's circumnavigation for another 2 marks. Again, giving you a chance to show off a bit broader knowledge, which is probably a positive change. Before we get into the predictions, a bit of a shameless plug for me. Have I helped you? If yes, then please help me to help others. As many of you know, I'm a full-time history teacher and a head of department at a secondary school. That's a lot of work on its own. Originally, these videos were just made for my personal students, and they remain my top priority. But now I know that I help thousands of others too, which is a really good feeling. This year, I've added crime and punishment and Cold War rapid revision playlists on top of my day job workload. These are not topics that I teach in school. These are things that I've done in my own time, and it's taken hundreds of hours of invested time, which has been really good. So if you want to thank me for my work and I have been helpful, then please do subscribe, and best of all, stay subscribed after all the exams are finished. I'm never going to charge for my content. I won't be starting a Patreon or anything like that. So this is the best way that you can thank me. All that begging out the way, let's consider how you should use these predictions. Well, first of all, you need to treat them with a certain amount of healthy caution. These predictions are actually more of a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018. Exam boards use the same topics repeatedly, as we'll see. The only way of being really sure is to try and know everything, which I know is not what you want to hear. But don't just focus your revision on these predictions. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you know you are weak on, use this as a guide to your revision. Now, last year I got quite a few things right, but I still don't know whether that was just dumb luck. But I'll be using the same methodology to try and make the predictions this year. So you never know, maybe I'll get it right again. We'll start with Early Elizabethan England. Let's consider last year's exam. Question 1A was describe 2 features of education in Early Elizabethan England. Bear in mind that this year that question is going to be split in 2 and each will be worth just 2 marks, so you'll only need to give 1 example for each. Question 1B was explain why the Spanish Armada was defeated for 12 marks. That was something I predicted actually, and it was a really popular question. And then you had a choice. Question C1 was the most significant threat to Elizabeth I's religious settlement in the years 1558 to 68 came from the English Catholics. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. The stimulus points were recusancy fines for not attending church and the Puritan campaign against crucifixes. And question C2 was poor planning was the main reason why the first colony in Virginia failed. How far do you agree? Explain your answer, with the stimulus points being Sir Walter Raleigh and the lack of food supplies. You'll notice that the stimulus points usually give 1 from each side of the argument. So if that was in last year's, what could be in this year's? The following have all been repeated inclusions. Mary Queen of Scots has appeared quite a lot in 2019, 2020 and 2023, and she's been relevant in lots of other questions too, which is not really surprising. She's a big part of the course. Also, the Catholic plots have pretty much all come up now. This has included the Babington plot, the revolt of the Northern Earls, and these have come up in the sample paper in 2020, 2021 and 2022. but not 2024, even though there was a question on Catholic challenges. That question only specified up as far as 1558, so it wouldn't have included these plots. So maybe it's going to come up again. It has been about 3 years. English involvement in the Netherlands has come up in 2021, 2022 and 2023. However, war with Spain more generally hasn't. So maybe this will come up again, or maybe it'll be relevant. I'm really not sure. And then the colonisation of Virginia, that's come up in 2019, 2023 and 2024. Perhaps it's going to be time for something different this year. By definition, this is the section that gets smaller every year. Things that have never appeared. The role of key ministers, for example the Secretary of State, has never appeared in the exam as a discrete question, nor has anything about the Privy Councillors. So looking at the different levels of Elizabethan society, like the Privy Council, the Royal Court, etc., might be a really good idea this year, because it hasn't come up and it is quite a big and important thing. Nor has the rise of the gentry, which is rather smaller, and that includes the yeomanry as well as a rising social class. So anything to do with Elizabethan social class and social structure, both in the countryside and in towns, is likely to be good revision this year. That's just a prediction. Economy and the reasons for poverty has never come up. Poverty as a more general topic has come up, but the specific reasons behind it, which would make a good 12-mark question, explaining the reasons for poverty, that's not come up yet. Maybe this year it will. These are all things that have only rarely appeared. War with Spain more generally. This appeared in 2021, although, as I've already said, the Netherlands has appeared several times, so this one might be a bit of an out there suggestion. Living standards and the so-called Golden Age, that's only appeared in 2021 as well, so thinking about whether living standards got better, what it was like in the towns compared to the countryside, anything to do with that. Again, there seems to be a bit of a theme of looking at Elizabethan society more broadly has not come up. And perhaps quite a surprising one, Elizabethan theatre and music has only really come up once in 2019, and that was only for a 4-mark describe question. Could it come up as a 2-marker this year, or maybe a part of a wider look at Elizabethan society? Anyway, I think that could be a good one to look at because it's quite a big area and it's not been covered. And increases in poverty, including rural poverty, only came up in 2018. So that one might be worth looking at as well, looking at the reasons for rural poverty, sheep farming, enclosure, that sort of stuff. It can be a little bit dry, so that's the sort of thing that you're likely to forget in class. I've got a rapid revision video on it though, so do some revision from that. Okay, that's the end of my predictions for Elizabethan England. Hopefully, I'll have got some of them right. Let's move on to Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. This is what last year's Anglo-Saxon and Norman England exam looked like. Question 1A. Describe 2 features of Anglo-Saxon government. That's another one that I predicted. However, remember this is going to be split into 2 different questions this year. Explain why the Normans built so many castles in England during William I's reign. That was worth 12 marks and it was a pretty popular and fair question. The stimulus points were England's border with Wales and rebellions. And then for question C. The first option was, after the death of Edward the Confessor, Edgar Atheling had the strongest claim to the throne. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. The stimulus points were family connection between Edward and Edgar and the House of Godwin. That was by far the most popular question that year. This one, not so many people did. Robert's ambition to take control in Normandy was the main reason for the difficult relationship between William I and his son Robert. How far do you agree? Explain your answer for 16 marks. The stimulus points were Robert's revolt in Normandy 1077 to 80 and Robert's childhood. Bearing in mind last year's questions, what have been the repeated inclusions? The Marcher Earldoms has come up a few times. It was in the sample paper, the 2021 paper and the 2022 paper, but that was 3 years ago. It's the sort of thing that could appear again. Castles, though, has come up even more often than that. That was in 2019, 2020, although bear in mind very few people did that exam, 2022 and 2024, so perhaps it's time for something different this year. Domesday Book is a really big topic and it's a big part of control and the later part of William's reign. It's appeared in the sample paper 2019 and it was a stimulus point in 2022. However, again, just like the Marcher Earldoms, this is the sort of thing that's quite big and it has been a little while, even though it's been mentioned quite a few times. This is the part of the video which you'd expect to get smaller every year, the things that have never appeared. Now I've included Anglo-Saxon society again. Now I predicted that government would come up last year and it did. However, the structure of Anglo-Saxon society really hasn't. So the different roles of people like the earls, churls, thanes, peasants within society, that's not really been covered. So looking at the hierarchy and structure of society and the burghs, things like that, that might be a really good idea this year. One of the ones I'm really surprised hasn't come up, although it would have been relevant in some questions, is Harold Godwinson's Norman Embassy. Perhaps this might come up as one of the 2-mark questions where you describe part of it. It might even form part of one of the 12-mark questions, or even a part of a 16-mark question looking for the reasons why William invaded. Harold Godwinson as king has not come up, and although it's on the specification, it's a really tiny topic. I don't think you need to spend too much time on that one there. After all, he wasn't king very long, was he? Maintaining Norman royal power is a really big topic, and it's come up in the sort of periphery a few times. So specific methods like doomsday and castles have appeared, but a generalised question looking at maintaining Norman royal power hasn't. So let's make sure that you're really secure on the ways in which William secured his power and then kept hold of it. The following have only rarely appeared. The first one's a little bit complicated. Early rebellions to Norman rule, 1068 to 70, which would include the rebellion of Hereward the Wake. Now this has appeared in the sample paper and the paper in 2021. This would also include, though, Edgar Atheling's rebellion, Edwin and Morcar's rebellion, and the rebellion of Hereward, and they're all combined together in the specification these days and typically taught as something of a block. The thing is, though, having taught this myself, I know that they're pretty chewy. There's a lot of confusing elements between them. They're not especially memorable, so it's probably a good idea to focus some revision on those and make sure you've got a decent grounding in it in case it appears this year. Also, and I find this one really surprising, there hasn't been a distinct question on the feudal system since 2018, which is the first year that the exam was set. Now, it would have been relevant to other questions using contextual knowledge, but I'm kind of surprised that it's not come up as its own thing. Then there's the Revolt of the Earls of 1075. Another really good story, but one that can be a bit difficult to remember and not to be confused with the earlier rebellions, which were typically Anglo-Saxon ones. This has only appeared in a 12-mark answer in 2019. The Norman Church has only appeared in a sample paper, which I find really surprising. So looking over what Lanfranc did with the church would probably be a really good idea, and how William both got the church's support and also used the church to help control England. So again, a recommendation to have a look at that. Bishop Odo has only appeared in one question, and that was a 12-mark question in 2023. Now, because there were quite a few marks attached to that question, perhaps it's a little bit too soon to look at Bishop Odo, but again, it's one of those things where if you're not familiar with it, well worth having a look at him. And the succession of William the Conqueror. I almost didn't include this one. It's relevant to the 2024 exam where it was part of a 16-mark answer. Again, it might be too soon, but it's only the only real time that that's appeared. All right, that's the end of my Anglo-Saxon and Norman predictions. We'll move on to the American West next. Let's have a look at last year's American West exam. Explain 2 consequences of the extermination of the buffalo for 8 marks. Bear in mind that this question will be split into 2 different 4-mark questions this year. Write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Donner Party expedition. The stimulus points were the shortcut and snow blizzards. I think I predicted both of those last year, which may be quite popular. And then explain 2 of the following. The importance of the railroad network for the cattle industry, which I think I predicted as well. The importance of the Sand Creek Massacre to relations with the Plains Indians, and the importance of sheriffs and marshals for law and order after 1876. And that's crucial, not the earlier period, that's a later one after 1876, also worth 8 marks. Bearing in mind that exam, what have been the repeated inclusions? The development of the cattle industry has come up relatively often in the sample paper 2019 and 2022, but it's also been relevant to other questions as well. The railroads have come up a fair bit as well, 2021, 2023 and 2024, so that's all pretty recent, maybe it's something else's turn. And similar with the Homestead Act, came up in the sample paper 2022 and 2024. But that's it, not a lot of repeated inclusions, but that's not surprising because of the narrowness of this paper. There's only really 3 sections to it, and so they can only ask about a certain number of things. The comparative narrowness of this paper means that there's actually quite a few things that have never really appeared, although they would have been relevant in your contextual knowledge for various questions over the years. One of them is problems setting along the plains. Think about all the challenges that the homesteaders, for example, face with ploughing and pests and a lack of timber. Also, conflict between indigenous peoples and settlers hasn't come up with its own distinct question, although it has been relevant to questions on, for example, Little Crow's War. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 has never appeared, although bear in mind the 1862 treaty has appeared in a consequences question, so make sure you know the difference between the 2. Crime and lawlessness appeared last year, but only in the sense of after 1876. Earlier responses, for example to the gold rush, didn't really appear before that time. Relations between ranchers and homesteaders has not come up with its own question either. The Oklahoma land rush and the associated closure of the so-called Indian frontier are also two things that have not come up with their own questions. Perhaps the biggest surprise to me though, given how major it is, there hasn't actually been a question on Wounded Knee yet. There have been questions on conflict with Indigenous peoples, but not this very key moment right at the end of the studies. And perhaps that's the thing. It comes right at the end of the studies and it's sort of seen as the end point of the major conflicts between Indigenous peoples and the American government and army, in this course at least. But I think it might be worth a look this year. We will see. And associated with that, looking at the life on the reservations for Indigenous peoples, the ways in which the government tried to make them assimilate with a European style of culture. All right, so there are quite a few things that have never really appeared in their own discrete questions. Let's consider the things that have only rarely appeared. Despite being something that's really recognisable, the Oregon Trail and wagon trains has only appeared in the 2020 paper, and that's maybe a bit of a surprise. Very few people did that paper and it's not being revisited. Early government policy to Indigenous peoples only appeared in that paper as well. Now I think this might be a really good target for your revision. Those early treaties and laws are actually pretty difficult to remember, and let's face it, they're all pretty boring as well. So having a look back over things like the Indian Removal Act, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, the Indian Appropriations Act, and the early Fort Laramie Treaty in 1851 will probably be a really good idea. Because if you're a bit fuzzy on that stuff because it wasn't terribly interesting and you did it on a Friday afternoon, it'd be a good idea to refresh your memory now. That's all I'm saying. Abilene has been relevant to some questions and I almost didn't include it. It has been in the sample paper, it's been relevant to the cattle industry questions, but you haven't actually had questions which are directly asking you about it. So one to bear in mind. The changing role of cowboys appeared in a 2019 8-mark question, but it's not really appeared since. Although knowledge of the cowboys and changes to the cattle industry have been relevant, a distinct question on the cowboys is maybe overdue. Early conflicts with Indigenous peoples. All right, now this is one that is a little bit controversial, not just because of the content, but because of the question attached to it. This would particularly include Little Crow's War. This was mentioned in a narrative account question with only a 2-year date range in 2018, where one of the stimulus points was Colonel Chivington, who only appears in a couple of places in most of the textbooks. However, I will point out that of the early conflicts with Indigenous peoples, the Sand Creek Massacre did appear last year, so maybe focus on other things. But Little Crow's War did come up. Remember what I keep saying though, the only way of being sure is to try and know it all. The exam board could put the same stuff in again. Related to that would be Red Cloud's War. Now that's related to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 as well, but maybe it is time to revisit that one there as well. It's been about 3 years since it's been in. And then we've got the Dawes Act and later government policy, including assimilation. This has only appeared in the very first exam, 2018 and 2020, which has hardly been looked at all. Again, this is a fairly complex topic. It's something that's quite big and it might be a really good focus for your revision. I feel like I've covered quite a lot with the American West topic, but that's just the way it's fallen. Okay, I hope it's been helpful. Who knows what we'll get right? Get revising. Good luck. Let's move on to superpower relations. The Cold War topic is an increasingly popular one. So what did last year's exam look like? Question number 1 was explain 2 consequences of the Prague Spring for 8 marks. Remember that question is being split into 2 different 4-mark questions this year. Question 2, write a narrative account analysing the collapse of the Soviet control in Eastern Europe between 1985 and 1991. That was for 8 marks. The stimulus points were Gorbachev's new thinking and the end of the Warsaw Pact. And then explain 2 of the following. The importance of the Yalta Conference for International Relations. Previous exams had looked at Potsdam and Tehran, so that completed the set. The importance of the Berlin Ultimatum for tensions between East and West. And the importance of SALT I, so that's the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty number 1, on relations between the USA and the USSR. So, bearing that in mind, what topics have come up time and again? The Grand Alliance and various conferences has been a popular topic over the years. In 2019 it was Potsdam, in 2021 it was Tehran, in 2023 in the narrative account it was relevant, and in 2024 it was Yalta. So maybe it's going to go back to one of the earlier conferences. Make sure that you know them all. Cuba and Soviet relations. That came up in 2018 with the Bay of Pigs, in 2019 with the Cuban Revolution, and it was part of an importance question in 2023. But there's a pretty important part of that hasn't had so much on it, which we'll come back to. Détente has also been quite a popular topic, but then it's quite a broad one, so that's hardly surprising. This was part of the narrative account in 2018, in 2021 it was part of the importance questions, and in 2023 it was part of the consequences question, and SALT 1 was relevant in 2024. So this has been something that has come up really quite a lot. The invasion of Afghanistan's come up as well. 2018 it was part of a narrative account, it was part of the importance question in 2020, although do bear in mind not many people did that exam, and it was also part of the consequences question in 2023. But maybe you could have a look at the outcomes of that and the international reaction to it. Reagan has not come up much recently, but it has come up quite a few times before. It came up in 2019 as part of the Second Cold War and importance. It came up in 2021 again with the Second Cold War and the Strategic Defensive Initiative of part of the narrative account question, and in 2023 again looking at SDI and importance. At the other end of the scale, here are the things that have never appeared. This should be the section that gets smaller every year. Ideological differences between communism and capitalism has never come up as its own question, although really I see this more as being about contextual knowledge, which helps you answer a more wide variety of questions rather than something you're likely to get a very distinct question on. Kennedy's Berlin visit in 1963 hasn't come up either. It might have been relevant to the Berlin Ultimatum stuff from last year, but probably not. Now this is the big one, I think. The events and consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now that did come up as a narrative account in the 2020 paper, but bear in mind that very few people did that paper, and this is an ideal one for looking at narrative accounts, both in terms of the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also the agreements and the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it could well be a consequences question or a narrative account question. If you're not really hot on this, this would be one of the ones I'd really suggest you look at. Reagan and Gorbachev in terms of their relations and how they developed over time, which again might make a good narrative account question, is also something that might be worth looking at. Though it is worth pointing out, of course, that Reagan and Gorbachev have appeared in other senses. It's just about how their relationship developed that hasn't. These are the ones that have only rarely appeared. Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. That's only appeared in 2022, which is maybe a bit surprising because this is a really big early part of this course. Could be a really good thing for you to revise if you're a bit unsure on it. In response to that, Cominform and Comic-Con. Now they've appeared in 2020, which was the exam very few people did, and 2023, which is quite recent, but I've just got a gut feeling about this one here. If there's something about the early development of the tensions between East and West, I can see this one coming up again. Similar to that is the creation of NATO. That was relevant to a 2020 question, but hasn't really come up again. So looking at the reasons for NATO and the consequences of that might be a really good idea, especially a consequences question. I can think of a lot of stuff for that. The Berlin blockade. That was relevant in 2024 probably, but it's not come up with its own discrete question except for in 2021. So maybe it's its turn again. The Hungarian uprising and reaction to it. Well, that was part of a 2019 narrative account, and also it was in that 2020 paper that not a lot of people did. I think the Prague Spring came up last year, so maybe it's the Hungarian uprising's turn this year. Brezhnev Doctrine was part of an importance question in 2018. It has been relevant to other things, but again, it's not had its own question since then. And lastly, reactions to the invasion of Afghanistan. Now, I want to make clear that yes, the invasion of Afghanistan itself has come up quite a few times. But looking at things like the Olympic boycott and Carter Doctrine, that's not really come up since 2022, where Carter Doctrine was part of an importance question. So that's my best bet for the superpower relations. But bear in mind, the only way of being sure is by knowing everything. My final words of advice, good luck, and things to bear in mind. Do remember, please, that these predictions were more a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018. Exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly, and the only way of being sure is to know everything. So if none of these predictions come up, please don't come begging to me. I've done my best. This is only a bit of thinking and advice. Don't just focus your revision on the predictions then. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you are weak on and you know that, use that to guide your revision and focus in on those areas. Check out the relevant final point slides on the videos that I've produced in the Rapid Revision series and try and memorise the key points. That's a really good way of going about it. And one bit of final personal advice, once the exam is done, move on. Discussing it after the event is rarely helpful. You'll only speak to a friend and they'll mention something that you wish you'd put in the exam. There's nothing you can do about it by then, it'll just ruin your summer. So get on with the next paper. I'll be releasing a video on paper 3 as soon as I get round to it. I am working absolutely flat out this time of year. I promise you I'm working as quick as I can. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and if it has, you know what to do. Like and subscribe. All the best, and I'll speak to you again soon. Goodbye.